While history always tells of the princes who fought for power, it overlooks the one who dared to declare war on power itself. That was Prince Maximilian of Saxony, a man born for the throne who instead found his destiny at the cross. This is not merely a story of faith, but a profound analysis of an escape, the story of a man so haunted by the curse of his royal destiny that he committed an act of sacred treason. He would renounce his title, abandon his kingdom, and kill the person he was meant to become. We will follow that spiritual suicide and uncover the internal war that made a throne more terrifying than any battlefield. To truly understand the radical choice Maximilian would one day make, we must transport ourselves back to the world he was born into, a world of dazzling splendor and deep seismic change. Our story begins in Dresden, the capital of the Kingdom of Saxony, in the year 1870. For centuries, Dresden had been known as the Florence on the Elbe, a jewel box of a city overflowing with artistic and cultural treasures. Its skyline was a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, dominated by the magnificent dome of the Frauenkirche and the spires of the Hofkirche, the Catholic cathedral that served the royal court. The city's Zwinger Palace housed one of Europe's finest art collections, including Raphael's Sistine Madonna, while its Semperoper opera house resounded with the revolutionary works of Richard Wagner. This was a city that breathed culture, a testament to the legacy of its rulers, the House of Wettin. The Wettins were one of the oldest and most distinguished royal dynasties in Europe, a family that had governed Saxony for over 800 years. Their history was a rich and complex saga. They had been electors of the Holy Roman Empire, patrons of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and in the 18th century, under Augustus the Strong, they had converted to Catholicism to secure the crown of Poland, forever setting their Catholic dynasty apart in a largely Protestant region of Germany. They were survivors, masters of art, politics, and reinvention. But the glittering world of 1870 was deceptive. The map of Europe was being violently redrawn. For decades, the patchwork of independent German kingdoms, principalities, and duchies had existed in a delicate balance. Now that balance was being shattered by the iron will of one state, Prussia. Under its brilliant and ruthless chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, Prussia was on a relentless march to unify Germany through blood and iron. The Franco-Prussian War was raging, and the old order was about to be swept away. It was into this crucible of change on the 17th of November 1870 that a seventh child was born in the Dresden Royal Palace. His name was a litany of royal connections: Maximilian Wilhelm August Albert Karl Gregor Odo. His father was Prince George of Saxony, a stern, traditional, and deeply devout man who was second in line to the Saxon throne. His mother, Infanta Maria Anna of Portugal, added a completely different, often overlooked dimension to his heritage. She was a daughter of the House of Braganza-Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, a woman whose own parents were Queen Maria II and King Ferdinand II of Portugal. Through her, the young Maximilian was infused with the blood of the Iberian Peninsula, a heritage of passionate faith, seafaring explorers, and a royal court with a culture far removed from the rigid formality of Germany. This subtle blend of Northern European discipline and Southern European piety would wage a quiet war within him for his entire life. Just a few months after his birth in January 1871, the world his family had known for centuries ended. Following Prussia's victory over France, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The Kingdom of Saxony, along with Bavaria, Württemberg, and others, ceased to be a truly independent nation. It was now a federal state within a new mighty empire, dominated by the Protestant Hohenzollern, emperor in Berlin. While Maximilian's grandfather, King John, and later his uncle, King Albert, kept their titles, their palaces, and their immense wealth, their political power was fundamentally diminished. They were kings, but they were no longer masters of their own destiny. Maximilian was therefore born into a paradox. He was a prince of a sovereign house that was no longer truly sovereign. He was raised in a world of breathtaking royal pageantry that masked a steady erosion of real influence. This was also a difficult time for devout Catholics within the new Germany. Bismarck, wary of any allegiance that might challenge the authority of his new state, launched the Kulturkampf, or culture struggle, a series of repressive measures aimed at curbing the power of the Catholic Church. For the staunchly Catholic Saxon royal family, this was a period of deep unease. They were now a religious minority within an empire whose leadership was actively hostile to their faith. This environment of a politically weakened throne and a besieged faith would have a profound and lasting impact on the young prince. This complex, tense reality was the air Maximilian breathed. Maximilian's childhood was the epitome of a 19th century royal upbringing, an existence governed by the twin pillars of duty and protocol. His days were not his own. They were meticulously scheduled from dawn until dusk. Lessons were drilled by a series of private tutors: French, the lingua franca of European courts; Latin, the language of the church and classical learning; history, which was essentially the history of his own ancestors; and of course music, art, and philosophy. But above all, the education of a Saxon prince was rooted in two inescapable disciplines: military training and religious instruction. From a young age, he and his brothers would have been dressed in miniature military uniforms, taught to ride and shoot, and instilled with the Prussian values of discipline, obedience, and honor. Simultaneously, their lives were saturated with the rituals of the Catholic faith. Daily Mass in the private chapel, instruction from the court chaplain, and the regular observance of feast days and fasts were as integral to their routine as their military drills. It was a world of stark contrasts. The gilded splendor of the palace with its priceless paintings and Meissen porcelain was juxtaposed with the cold Spartan discipline of the schoolroom and the parade ground. The soaring, ethereal music of the Mass was followed by the shouted commands of a drill sergeant. For a young boy, it must have been a bewildering and often contradictory existence. Within this rigid structure, Maximilian's own personality began to emerge, and it was clear from early on that he was different. His elder brother, Frederick Augustus, the crown prince and future king, was affable, popular, and pragmatic, perfectly suited for the role of a modern constitutional monarch. His other brothers were robust, outgoing, and embraced the military life expected of them. Maximilian, however, was an anomaly. In a world of soldiers and statesmen, he was a quiet scholar. In a dynasty that prized the sword, he was drawn to the crucifix. While his brothers found their purpose on the riding grounds and in mock battles, Maximilian found his in the quiet solitude of the palace library and the hushed, incense-filled atmosphere of the chapel. He was said to be fascinated by the lives of the saints, men and women who had turned their backs on worldly power to pursue a life of spiritual devotion. He was drawn to stories of sacrifice, not conquest. A crucial factor in his psychological development was his position in the family. He was the seventh of 8 children. In the brutal calculus of royal succession, this made him an afterthought. The hopes of the dynasty rested on his elder brother. The other brothers had their defined roles in the army. Maximilian, so far down the line of succession, was effectively surplus to requirements. In a family where your worth was defined by your rank and your designated purpose, to be without a clear purpose could be a source of profound existential anxiety. But for Maximilian, this very irrelevance may have been a secret, liberating gift. Unburdened by the expectation of one day wearing a crown, his mind was free to wander down paths forbidden to his siblings. He was not destined to be a king or a general. So, what was he to be? This sense of being an outsider within the ultimate insiders club likely fostered a powerful interior world. While court life swirled around him, a constant procession of state banquets, diplomatic receptions, and formal balls, he was an observer, not a central participant. He watched the performance of royalty from the wings. He saw the immense effort, the endless ritual, the personal sacrifice required to maintain the facade of power. And perhaps even as a young man, he began to question its value. Was this life of gilded ceremony, of hand-kissing and medal-wearing, a life of true meaning? Or was it an elaborate, empty charade? The pressure to conform was, of course, immense. His father, Prince George, was a man of his time, a soldier king who equated duty to the dynasty with duty to God. He would have expected all his sons to follow the path of service to the Saxon state. Any deviation would have been seen not just as a personal choice, but as a betrayal of their sacred heritage. The family motto of the House of Wettin was Providentiae Memor, mindful of providence. For his father, Providence had made them princes, and their duty was to live and die as such. But for Maximilian, a different interpretation of that motto was beginning to take shape. Perhaps Providence had a different plan for him, one that had nothing to do with thrones or armies. As he entered his late teens and early 20s, this internal tension grew. He was expected to embark on a military career, the standard path for a prince in his position. He would have been given a commission in a prestigious Saxon or Prussian regiment, a life of comfortable barracks, elegant officers' messes, and the slow, predictable climb up the ranks. He was also expected to marry. A suitable bride would have been chosen for him from one of the many Catholic royal houses of Europe, a Bavarian duchess, an Austrian archduchess, or perhaps a Spanish infanta, a marriage designed to strengthen dynastic alliances. But as he looked down this well-trodden path, a path of predictable duty and worldly comfort, Maximilian felt a growing sense of dread. It felt less like a life and more like a sentence. He was being drawn in a completely opposite direction, toward a life of radical simplicity, intellectual rigor, and spiritual service. The conflict between the life he was born into and the life his soul was yearning for was becoming unbearable. A crisis was looming, one that would force him to make a choice that would scandalize his family, renounce an 800-year-old legacy, and set him on one of the most extraordinary and solitary paths ever taken by a modern European royal. The world expected him to be a prince, but in his heart he was hearing the call to become something else entirely. The final decade of the 19th century was a time of profound anxiety and exhilarating change across Europe. It was the fin de siècle, an era of glittering contradictions. In the gaslit cities of Vienna, Paris, and Berlin, unprecedented wealth and industrial power existed alongside crushing poverty and social unrest. The arts were exploding with the vibrant, unsettling colors of Impressionism and the discordant harmonies of modernist music. In philosophy, thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche had declared the death of God, sending a tremor of doubt through the very foundations of Western civilization. It was an age of frantic energy, of crumbling certainties, and of a pervasive sense that the old world, the world of emperors, kings, and unquestioned faith, was coming to a dramatic and violent end. For Prince Maximilian of Saxony, now in his early 20s, this external cultural crisis was mirrored by a fierce and unrelenting storm within his own soul. The life laid out for him, a comfortable and gilded path of aristocratic duty, now seemed not just unfulfilling but spiritually toxic. He was a man haunted by eternity in a world obsessed with the material. He performed the duties expected of him. He attended military parades in his immaculate uniform, made polite conversation at endless court functions, and dutifully partnered eligible duchesses in the waltz. But his heart was elsewhere. In his private moments, in the quiet of the Dresden court chapel, or alone with his books, he was wrestling with the most fundamental questions a person can ask. Who am I? What is my purpose? And what does God truly demand of me? The answer that began to form in his mind was as terrifying as it was liberating. The life of a prince, he concluded, was an obstacle to salvation. He did not merely find his existence empty. He found it to be a diabolical temptation, a gilded snare woven by pride and the world's false promises. Every polished military button, every whispered flattery from a courtier, every bow and salute was a poisonous distraction from the path to salvation. He saw his lineage not as a heritage, but as a curse he was compelled to break. His decision was not merely to change careers, it was a spiritual necessity, a desperate, radical act to kill the prince he was born to be so that the priest could be born. This was the execution of the prince, a sacred treason against the house of Wettin, demanded by the house of God. This was not a passing phase of youthful rebellion. It was a deep, gnawing conviction that grew stronger with each passing year. One can imagine him in the vast, silent library of the palace, poring over the works of the church fathers and the lives of the desert saints, men like Saint Anthony, who had abandoned a life of wealth to pursue God in the solitude of the wilderness. He saw in their stories a blueprint for his own life. He felt an intense, almost physical, pull toward a life of renunciation, a desire to strip himself of everything that defined him in the eyes of the world so that he could stand naked and unadorned before his Creator. The military career, the strategic marriage, the comfortable obscurity of a minor royal. This future felt like a slow, comfortable death. He craved a different kind of death, not of the body, but of the title, a radical voluntary execution of the prince, so that the man could finally be born. The decision crystallized over several years of intense prayer and internal debate. Finally, in 1896, at the age of 25, he knew he could no longer live a divided life. He resolved to take the most radical step imaginable for a man in his position. He would not just become a more devout layman. He would renounce everything. He would give up his rights to the throne, his income, and his place in the line of succession, and his family's plans for his future. He would petition to enter the seminary and dedicate his life to God as a Catholic priest. The announcement fell like a bomb on the deeply traditional Saxon court. The reaction from his family was not just disappointment, it was a mixture of horror, outrage, and sheer incomprehension. The most formidable opposition came from his father, Prince George. A man forged in the crucible of the 19th century military aristocracy, George saw the world in stark terms of duty, honor, and lineage. For him, Maximilian's decision was a profound betrayal on every level. It was a betrayal of his family, a shirking of the sacred duty that came with the privilege of their name. It was a betrayal of his kingdom. Princes were born to serve the state, not to retreat into monasteries. And it was a betrayal of his class. The officer corps was the bedrock of the German establishment, and to abandon it for a cassock was seen as an act of weakness, an almost effeminate rejection of masculine responsibility. We can only imagine the confrontations that must have taken place within the formal, emotionally repressed confines of the Dresden Palace. There would have been no shouting matches, but rather a series of cold, tense audiences. Prince George, his back ramrod straight, would have appealed to his son's sense of honor, reminding him of the sacrifices their ancestors had made to preserve the Wettin dynasty. He would have framed it as a matter of loyalty. How could he, a Saxon prince, declare his ultimate allegiance to a pope in Rome, especially at a time when the German Empire was still deeply suspicious of Catholic power? To George, this was not a crisis of faith. It was an act of desertion. His son was not merely leaving the family. He was abandoning his post in the middle of a war for the dynasty's soul. Maximilian's mother, Infanta Maria Anna, would have been caught in a heartbreaking conflict. As a woman of profound Portuguese piety, she surely understood and perhaps even secretly admired the depth of her son's faith. A part of her must have felt a mother's pride in his spiritual devotion, but she was also the wife of the heir to the throne, and her primary duty was to her husband and the dynasty. She would have been torn between her sympathies as a devout Catholic and her obligations as a princess. Her pleas would have been softer, appealing perhaps to his love for her and the pain his decision was causing the family. His brothers, steeped in the unquestioning masculine culture of the military, would have likely reacted with a mixture of bewilderment and contempt. To them, who defined themselves by their rank and their regiments, Maximilian's choice would have seemed like madness, a complete abdication of everything a man was supposed to be. The scandal rippled outwards, becoming a topic of hushed gossip in the letters and drawing rooms of their royal cousins across Europe. To the largely Protestant courts of Britain and Prussia, it was seen as a bizarre and slightly alarming example of the romantic, mystical excesses of Catholicism. The Saxon royal, it was whispered, had lost his mind to religious fanaticism, but Maximilian remained resolute. He had weathered the storm of his own internal crisis, and the anger of his family seemed almost insignificant in comparison. His decision was not an emotional whim. It was the settled, unshakable conviction of his entire being. Seeing that he could not be swayed, his family had no choice but to acquiesce, albeit with immense disapproval. The formal legal process of his renunciation was set in motion. It was a systematic dismantling of his identity. He signed documents formally relinquishing his place in the line of succession, a right that, while distant, was an integral part of his status. More concretely, he renounced his claim to the royal appanage, the generous annual income funded by the state that guaranteed him a life of effortless luxury. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a voluntary vow of poverty, a severing of the financial cord that had sustained him. In the eyes of the state and the court, His Royal Highness Prince Maximilian of Saxony ceased to exist. He became simply Maximilian of Saxony, a private citizen. With the legal ties cut, his departure from the palace was imminent. The final farewells must have been excruciatingly painful. He was not just leaving home for university, he was leaving his family, his class, his culture, and his entire world behind. Forever. The break was absolute. One day, he was a prince, living in a palace with an army of servants at his beck and call. The next, he was on a train to Würzburg, a university town in Bavaria, with little more than a few simple belongings, to begin a new life as an anonymous seminarian. His arrival in Würzburg marked the beginning of his true transformation. The city itself, with its magnificent Baroque residence, the former palace of the powerful prince-bishops, was a historic center of German Catholicism. But Maximilian was not there to admire the architecture. He was there to disappear into the rigorous, anonymous life of a theology student. He enrolled in the university and began his studies, living a life of stark, almost brutal simplicity that was a deliberate and constant rejection of his past. His new home was not a princely apartment, but a Spartan cell, likely containing little more than a narrow bed, a simple wooden desk and chair, a washstand, and a crucifix on the wall. The contrast with his former life was staggering. The fine silk sheets were replaced by rough wool blankets. The valet, who had laid out his clothes each morning, was replaced by the solitary act of dressing himself in the simple black attire of a seminarian. The multi-course banquets served on priceless porcelain were replaced by plain communal meals, eaten in silence or while listening to a spiritual reading. His days were now governed not by the intricate protocol of the court, but by the ancient rhythmic discipline of the monastic bell. He would rise before dawn for matins and lauds, the first prayers of the day, recited in a cold, dark chapel. His mornings and afternoons were filled with intense academic work, lectures on dogmatic theology, moral philosophy, and scripture, often delivered in Latin, the universal language of the Church. He immersed himself in the dominant theological school of the time, Neo-Scholasticism, a rigorous revival of the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. But his particular passion was for two specific fields: canon law, the intricate legal system that governs the Church, and the history and theology of the Eastern Orthodox churches. He would spend countless hours in the university library, a quiet, black-clad figure hunched over ancient texts, finally feeding an intellectual hunger that the superficial life of the court could never satisfy. It was during this period that his commitment to asceticism became most apparent. He was not content merely to live a simple life. He actively sought out hardship as a way of disciplining his body and soul, of purging the last remnants of princely softness. It is from this time that the anecdote of the single toothbrush likely originates. The story, whether literally true or an exaggeration, captures a profound truth about his mindset. He was engaged in a form of spiritual warfare against his own past, using physical deprivation as a weapon. He was trying to erase the prince, not just in name, but in his very flesh. For 3 years he lived this life, a life of prayer, study, and profound voluntary obscurity. He had successfully traded the expectations of his father for the demands of his God. He had swapped the gilded cage of the Dresden palace for the liberating discipline of a seminarian cell. He had found his true identity not in a royal title, but in his vocation. Finally, in the summer of 1899, his period of formation came to its culmination. In a ceremony rich with 1,000 years of tradition, Maximilian of Saxony was ordained a priest. The contrast with his baptism 29 years earlier could not have been more stark. His baptism had been a grand affair of state attended by royals and dignitaries, a ceremony that proclaimed him a prince and bound him to a dynasty. His ordination was a ceremony of profound self-abnegation. He lay prostrate on the cold stone floor of the cathedral, a symbol of his own unworthiness and his total surrender to God. The bishop laid hands on his head, conferring the sacrament, and anointed his hands with holy chrism, consecrating them for the service of the altar. As he rose to his feet, he was no longer Maximilian of Saxony, the forgotten seventh child, the royal eccentric. He was Father Maximilian. The prince was dead. The long, agonizing journey of renunciation was over, and a new journey, a life of service as a scholar and a priest, was just beginning. Following his ordination in 1899, Father Maximilian's journey took him briefly to the historic city of Nuremberg. There, he served as a parish priest, a humble curate in a bustling urban church. For the first time, he was immersed in the daily practical life of the clergy, baptizing infants, hearing the confessions of shopkeepers and laborers, visiting the sick, and celebrating the Mass for an ordinary congregation. This brief period was an essential grounding, a necessary transition from the rarefied world of theological theory to the messy, complicated reality of human lives. But it quickly became clear to both Maximilian and his superiors that his greatest gifts were not those of a parish administrator. His was a mind built for the library, the lecture hall, and the intricate world of scholarship. In August 1900, a path opened that would define the rest of his professional life. He was offered and eagerly accepted an appointment as professor of canon law at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. It was a perfect match, a sanctuary for his unique and complex identity. Fribourg itself was a beautiful medieval city, nestled in a bend of the Serene River, a bastion of Swiss Catholicism. The university was young, founded just a decade earlier, and had a deliberately international character. Situated in neutral, multilingual Switzerland, it attracted Catholic scholars and students from across Europe, making it a vibrant, intellectual crossroads, free from the overt political pressures of the German Empire and the lingering tensions of Bismarck's Kulturkampf. For a man who was himself a product of German and Portuguese heritage, a prince who had abandoned nationalism for a universal faith, Fribourg was not just a workplace. It was a spiritual and intellectual home. Maximilian settled into a new rhythm, the quiet, ordered life of an academic. The rigorous, physically demanding asceticism of his seminary years softened into a life of disciplined intellectual labor. His days were now structured around research, writing, and, most importantly, teaching. And it was as a teacher that his unusual character truly shone. He consciously rejected the aristocratic distance that might have been expected of him. In a remarkable act of solidarity and humility, he chose for a time to live not in a comfortable professor's residence, but in a simple room within a student dormitory. One can imagine the curiosity and awe he must have inspired. His students were young men from across Europe, and here, living among them, was a man who could have been a reigning prince. He was living proof of the concepts he taught, of sacrifice, of the rejection of worldly vanity. This proximity made him an approachable and beloved figure. He was not a dry, dusty academic, but a passionate and engaging lecturer who brought the arcane complexities of canon law and church history to life. His royal background, the very thing he sought to suppress, gave him an unspoken authority and a unique perspective. He had seen the inner workings of power, both secular and ecclesiastical, and he could speak of it with an insight that no ordinary professor could match. He became a mentor to a generation of students, a living embodiment of the idea that a life of the mind was a noble and worthy calling. Parallel to his teaching, he pursued his research with relentless energy. He was not a generalist. He had a specific consuming passion, the history, theology, and law of the Eastern Orthodox churches. In the early 20th century, this was a relatively niche and often neglected field of study within the Catholic world. The official attitude of the Vatican towards the Orthodox was one of condemnation. They were viewed as schismatics who had stubbornly broken away from the authority of the one true church in Rome. The prevailing hope was not for reconciliation, but for their eventual conversion and return to the fold. Maximilian's approach was radically different. He studied the Orthodox tradition not as a collection of errors, but with deep respect and a genuine desire for understanding. He learned their languages, delved into the writings of their theologians, the Greek fathers, and developed a profound appreciation for their ancient liturgies and spiritual traditions. He saw in orthodoxy not a rival, but a sister church, a separated lung of the same Christian body. This scholarly work was not merely an academic exercise. It was fueled by a burning, deeply personal dream. He became convinced that the great schism of 1054, the 1,000-year-old wound that had split Christendom, was a tragic historical mistake that could and must be healed. He began to envision himself as a theological bridge builder, a man uniquely positioned to help reconcile the Latin West and the Greek East. This ambition, however, was developing in a dangerously hostile climate. The Catholic Church at the time was in the grip of what became known as the Modernist crisis. Pope Pius X, who reigned from 1903 to 1914, was a man of deep personal holiness, but also of inflexible reactionary conviction. He saw the modern world, with its science, its liberal politics, its historical criticism, as a toxic threat to the purity of the Catholic faith. In his 1907 encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, he fiercely condemned modernism as the synthesis of all heresies. A network of informants was established to report suspected modernists to the Vatican, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion in Catholic universities and seminaries. In 1910, the Pope went even further, issuing the anti-modernist oath, which all clergy, professors, and seminary rectors were required to swear, obliging them to reject a long list of philosophical and theological propositions. It was an intellectual lockdown, a declaration of war against theological innovation. It was into this treacherous minefield that Father Maximilian, driven by his ecumenical passion, bravely or perhaps naively stepped. In 1910, he published a scholarly article that would become the crisis point of his life. Titled Thoughts on the Question of the Reunion of the Churches, it laid out his vision for healing the schism. His proposals were, for the time, revolutionary. He argued that if the Orthodox churches were to reunite with Rome, they must be allowed to retain their own venerable traditions. This included their ancient liturgies, the right for their priests to be married, and a significant degree of administrative autonomy for their patriarchs. Most controversially, he framed the entire project not as a conversion of the Orthodox, but as a reunion of equals, respectfully acknowledging the validity of their sacraments and their apostolic lineage. To the guardians of orthodoxy in Rome, this was not bridge building. It was heresy. The article was immediately attacked by conservative theologians and denounced to the Holy Office, the Vatican department responsible for doctrinal purity. In the paranoid climate of the anti-modernist campaign, Maximilian's respectful approach to the Orthodox was seen as a dangerous form of indifferentism, the belief that one religion is as good as another. His call for decentralization was seen as a direct challenge to the doctrine of papal supremacy, which had been so forcefully defined at the First Vatican Council. The prince who had sacrificed a kingdom for the church was now branded its enemy. The scholar was labeled a heretic, the priest a modernist. In a moment of supreme theological irony, the man who had abandoned a throne to find God was now accused of betraying him. The pressure from the Vatican was swift, brutal, and overwhelming. He was ordered to retract his work. Maximilian was faced with the most agonizing choice of his life. He could stand by his scholarly convictions, the fruit of years of prayerful study, and face public condemnation, the loss of his teaching position, and almost certain excommunication. To do so would make him a true outcast, rejected by the very institution he had sacrificed his old life to join. Or he could submit to the authority of the Pope, the authority he had sworn an oath to obey, and in doing so sacrifice his intellectual integrity and betray his own conscience. For a man whose entire identity was now built on his loyalty to the Church, defiance was ultimately impossible. He broke. In a public statement that must have been excruciating to write, he formally retracted his article. He declared his unconditional and unlimited submission to the authority of the Pope and reaffirmed his belief in every doctrine of the Catholic Church. It was a complete and deeply humiliating capitulation. A legend later grew that he was summoned to Rome for a private audience with Pope Pius X, where he knelt before the pontiff, was personally reprimanded, and then granted absolution. While this story of a personal reconciliation is a compelling one, there is no official record to support it. It remains a piece of folklore, a poignant wish for a gentle end to a brutal affair. The reality was that the 1910 controversy was a crushing, spirit-breaking defeat. It marked the end of Maximilian's bold dream. He had flown too close to the sun of ecclesiastical power, and his wings had been melted. He would continue to teach and write about the Eastern churches for the rest of his life, but the bold reformist fire had been extinguished. He would never again publicly challenge the prevailing doctrines of his time. The man who had escaped the rigid conformity of a royal court had learned a bitter lesson. The intellectual conformity demanded by the Church could be just as absolute and far more unforgiving. 4 years later, the world that had censured him was consumed by a far greater madness. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 triggered a catastrophic chain of events, and by August, the great powers of Europe were at war. The First World War was a conflict that swept away the old world of empires and aristocracies, the very world that Maximilian had been born into. For him, now in his mid-40s, the war offered a new, different kind of calling, one that pulled him from the quiet confines of the university library into a world of unimaginable suffering. Though he was a resident of neutral Switzerland, he remained a German citizen and a Prince of Saxony by birth. He immediately volunteered his services to the German army and was commissioned as a military chaplain. This new role brought the two halves of his life together in a profoundly challenging way. The scholar of abstract legal texts was now confronted with the most visceral human realities. He served behind the lines on both the Western and Eastern fronts, living in field camps and moving among the endless streams of wounded and dying men. His duties were harrowing. He celebrated Mass on makeshift altars just miles from the front, with the sound of artillery fire as the accompaniment. He heard the last confessions of young men, boys of 18 or 19, their bodies torn apart by shrapnel and machine gun fire. He administered the last rites amidst the filth and stench of overwhelmed field hospitals, offering a final moment of spiritual comfort in a world that had descended into hell. He wrote countless letters to grieving parents, trying to find words of solace for an agony he could barely comprehend. This experience of industrial-scale slaughter must have tested his faith in ways his theological controversies never could. Yet his unique status also allowed him to perform a different kind of service. Leveraging his position in neutral Switzerland, he worked extensively with the International Red Cross in Geneva. Speaking fluent French and German and carrying the weight of his family name, he was able to act as an intermediary, helping to track missing soldiers and facilitate the exchange of mail for French prisoners of war held in German camps. He used the very royal name he had abandoned to open the gates of prison camps, helping French prisoners to contact their families. This was a quiet, thankless, but deeply humanitarian mission. The image of the Prince Priest, moving between the horrors of the battlefield and the quiet, ordered offices of the Red Cross, captures the essence of his wartime existence. A man caught between his loyalty to his homeland and his higher loyalty to a Christian ethic of compassion that knew no borders. As the war ground on, it brought not just death and destruction, but revolution. In November 1918, facing total military defeat and widespread mutiny at home, the German Empire collapsed. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. Across Germany, princes, dukes, and kings were swept from their thrones. In Dresden, a revolutionary council demanded the abdication of Maximilian's own brother, King Frederick Augustus III. On November 13, 1918, the king complied. With a stroke of a pen, 829 years of continuous rule by the House of Wettin in Saxony came to an abrupt and unceremonious end. The news would have reached Maximilian in Switzerland. The kingdom he was born to serve was gone. The throne he had personally renounced 2 decades earlier had now been destroyed by history. It must have been a moment of surreal and bitter irony. His radical act, once seen as the ultimate betrayal, was now revealed to be the ultimate prophecy. In 1896, he was deemed a madman for abandoning a throne. In 1918, history declared him a prophet, for he had escaped a kingdom that was already rotting and about to be wiped out. The war was over. His family was in exile. His country was in chaos. And he, Father Maximilian, a man stripped of his princely past, his nation's old order, and his own youthful intellectual ambitions, was left to face a new and uncertain world with only his faith and his scholarship to guide him. The armistice of November 1918 did not bring peace to Europe, but rather a fractured, exhausted silence. The Great War had been a continental suicide, a cataclysm that had not just killed a generation of young men, but had also shattered the very foundations of the old world. The great multinational empires that had governed Europe for centuries, the Hohenzollerns of Germany, the Habsburgs of Austria, Hungary, the Romanovs of Russia, and the Ottomans of Turkey, were all gone, swept away by the violent tides of defeat, revolution, and nationalism. In their place was a chaotic landscape of new, unstable republics, simmering ethnic grievances, and a collective psychological trauma that would poison the decades to come. For Father Maximilian of Saxony, returning to his quiet academic life at the University of Freiburg, the world he re-entered was almost unrecognizable. He was now a man approaching 50, a citizen of a German nation that was no longer an empire, but a deeply divided and humiliated republic, struggling under the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles. More personally, he was a prince of a defunct kingdom. His family, the House of Wettin, after more than 800 years of uninterrupted rule, were now private citizens. His brother, the former King Frederick Augustus III, was living in exile at a castle in Silesia, spending his days hunting and grumbling about the end of his reign. The vast royal estates had been confiscated by the new Republican government, and while the family retained a significant measure of private wealth, their public role was gone forever. They were historical artifacts, ghosts haunting the corridors of their own former palaces. There is a profound and poignant irony in this. For decades, Maximilian had been the family outcast, the man who had committed the scandalous act of voluntarily renouncing his royal status. Now, history had violently forced that same status upon his entire family. His personal spiritual choice had been universalized by political catastrophe. He had chosen his path, while they had been dragged unwillingly onto theirs. One can only speculate on his feelings as he observed his family's new life from his tranquil Swiss perch. Was there a sense of sorrow for their loss, undoubtedly, but perhaps there was also a quiet, somber sense of vindication. He had recognized, long before anyone else in his family, that the crowns and titles of the old world were hollow, that their foundations were cracking. He had found a lifeboat in his faith decades before the ship of monarchy finally went under. He resumed his duties as professor of canon law, but he was a changed man. The horrors of the war had left an indelible mark on him. The academic who had once passionately debated the finer points of ecclesiastical law had spent 4 years witnessing the brutal, visceral consequences of worldly ambition and hatred. The theological crisis of 1910 had already tempered his reformist zeal. The war seemed to have extinguished it completely, replacing it with a more sober, introspective, and perhaps melancholic wisdom. He returned to his scholarship, particularly his work on the Eastern churches, but his approach was different now. The bold, youthful dream of grand-scale reunion was gone. Instead, he dedicated himself to the quieter, more patient work of fostering understanding, of detailed historical research, and of teaching a new generation to appreciate the rich traditions of a separated sister church. His life in Fribourg settled into a steady monastic rhythm that would characterize the remainder of his days. It was a life of profound and deliberate simplicity. He would rise early, celebrating Mass in his private chapel before dawn. He would spend his mornings preparing lectures or working on his scholarly publications, his afternoons teaching, and his evenings in reading and prayer. He created a small, ordered world for himself, a fortress of faith and reason against the growing chaos of the 20th century. He had found his harbor, a place of peace built not on worldly security, but on the unshakable certainties of his intellectual and spiritual convictions. He was a figure out of time, a man whose quiet contemplative existence was a silent rebuke to the frantic, politicized, and increasingly violent age unfolding around him. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the shadows began to lengthen once more over his German homeland. The economic devastation of the Great Depression, coupled with the lingering humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, created a fertile ground for political extremism. From the beer halls of Munich, the hateful pseudo-mystical ideology of Nazism began its terrifying rise. For Maximilian, a man of deep intellect, traditional Catholic faith, and cosmopolitan heritage, everything about the Nazi movement would have been anathema. He would have been repulsed by its crude paganistic rituals and its elevation of blood and soil above universal Christian values. He would have been horrified by its violent anti-Semitism, which stood in stark opposition to the teachings of the church he had dedicated his life to. And he would have been disgusted by its hyper-nationalism and its cult of the leader, which demanded a total idolatrous allegiance that no true Christian could give. While some German aristocrats were seduced by the Nazis' promises of national restoration and a bulwark against communism, and others joined the resistance against them, Maximilian remained a distant, sorrowful observer. He had long ago chosen a kingdom not of this world, and he could only watch in despair as his former earthly home once again descended into a madness far worse than the one he had witnessed in the Great War. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Maximilian was nearly 70 years old. He remained in Fribourg, a quiet, elderly German academic living in the precarious safety of neutral Switzerland. He was now utterly a spectator to history, listening to the news of the Blitz, the invasion of Russia, and the unfolding horror of the Holocaust on the radio. It is during this dark period that we find the last testament to his character, a final act of quiet, courageous defiance. According to several historical accounts, though concrete proof is scarce, Maximilian used his position and his network within the Swiss Catholic Church to aid Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. This act, while shrouded in the secrecy of the times, is entirely consistent with the man he had become. The same humanitarian impulse that had driven him to help French prisoners in the First World War now drove him to help the most vulnerable victims of the Second. We can imagine him using his old, almost forgotten, family name to open a door here, or making a quiet phone call to a contact in a monastery near the border there. Perhaps he provided funds from his modest professorial income or helped arrange safe passage through the church's extensive underground network. This final act of compassion in the face of absolute evil cemented his legacy as a silent aristocratic resistance figure, a man who refused to be a bystander. It was the final practical application of his faith, a quiet refusal to be a bystander to evil, a last affirmation of his belief in a common humanity that transcended race, nation, and creed. The war ended in 1945, leaving Germany and much of Europe in ruins. For Maximilian, the end of the war brought one final devastating blow. In February 1945, in a series of infamous air raids, Allied bombers unleashed a firestorm that utterly destroyed his home city of Dresden. The Florence on the Elbe, the magnificent Baroque jewel where he had been born, was incinerated. The Frauenkirche, the Semperoper, and the Zwinger Palace were all left as blackened, hollowed-out shells. The royal palace where he had grown up was a smoldering ruin. This act was more than just a strategic bombing. It was the physical and symbolic annihilation of the world that had produced him. The kingdom had vanished in 1918. Now, its very stones had been turned to dust. It was the final, brutal erasure of his past. Maximilian lived for 6 more years, a very old man, in a new and unfamiliar world. He was a living link to a lost civilization, a man who had been born in the age of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages, and had lived to see the dawn of the atomic age. He had known kings and emperors who were now mere footnotes in history books. He had outlived his kingdom, his city, and almost all of his certainties, save one. On the 6th of January 1951, at the age of 80, Father Maximilian of Saxony died peacefully in his sleep in Freiburg. His long, solitary, and extraordinary journey had finally come to an end. The final act of his life, his burial, was perhaps the most powerful and ironic statement of all. He was not interred in a simple grave in Switzerland. Instead, his body was brought back to Dresden and laid to rest in the Wettin crypt of the Hofkirche Cathedral, the traditional resting place of his royal ancestors. The prince who had renounced his dynasty in life was ultimately reclaimed by it in death. In the annals of empires and battles, the name Maximilian of Saxony is but a forgotten whisper. He passed no laws, won no battles, and had virtually no impact on the political destiny of his nation, remaining largely forgotten in the grand narrative of the 20th century. However, his legacy is not one of political achievement. It is a quiet, profound story about the search for authenticity. Born into the ultimate gilded cage, he found the courage to reject it. In an age defined by rising nationalism, materialism, and militarism, he chose a radically countercultural path, a life dedicated to scholarship, humanity, and God as a Catholic priest. His story is defined by staggering contradictions. He was the prince who embraced poverty, the German patriot who spent a war helping enemy prisoners, and the ambitious scholar who was publicly silenced by the very institution he sacrificed everything to serve. He voluntarily renounced a throne only to live long enough to see his family violently lose it to history. His life can be seen as a tragedy, a sensitive man crushed by the demands of dynasty and dogma. Yet to see it only as a failure is to miss the point. In a century defined by a catastrophic lust for power, his rebellion was not to seize a different throne, but to reject the very premise of worldly power itself. For this reason, the story of Father Maximilian is ultimately not a tragedy of the crown that was lost, but a quiet triumph of the soul that was found. He traded a kingdom of earth for a kingdom of the spirit. His life is a haunting testament that true power is not the throne you inherit, but the one you have the courage to walk away from.